Hello, Thomas Park here. Just been sharing some thoughts I've had lately about, oh, a lot of it about my life and where I view that I fit in or don't in the world around me, and if that's significant or important, and to what degree, and things like that. I guess I'm getting old enough to have thoughts like that are more sort of summary thoughts or broader thoughts about my life and who I am and what I've been through. I actually don't talk that much about myself to others, and usually when I do, it's in a joke or humor. So this is kind of actually unusual for me. Um, but I wanted to talk about maybe I guess the biggest victory I've had, in my opinion, in life is to remain functioning and in some ways to help kick a schizophrenia diagnosis enough to lead an active and exciting life, and maybe even enough that if I was re interviewed, I might come across as healthier today, possibly have a less severe diagnosis. I can't verify that, but the fact that I'm not trying to is part of the issue of how to go about this. When I was being treated for schizophrenia, um, I had been diagnosed. I should pedal back a little bit. When I was diagnosed, basically there were a few questions, and then I went to speak to a doctor, a psychiatrist, and I was sitting there and I wasn't saying anything because I was very depressed and had been dissipated and kind of was down on myself. And the psychiatrist said he thinks he's Christ, and I didn't have the energy to deny that. So to this day, I regret that. I think I should have stood up and said, "Please, doctor, I don't think that. I'm just going through a tough period in my life." But my refusal to react was part of the whole problem. So anything that makes me feel like my experience, my subjective experience, is different from other people, including my interior life. So my first intuition when I was younger was what's going on in my head is probably only me experiencing it. And there was good and bad to that idea. But the more I grew older, and even through my diagnosis, I thought, am I so sure that what I'm experiencing in my mind is that different from the things that other people are? Including things like periods where it was difficult to think at all, periods where I was dealing a lot with pain management, or just simple tasks of the day and trying to endure them. I kind of realized while working with people who were presumably sane, I suppose, who were sane and didn't have a diagnosis, that they would spend a lot of their time just going about the day and trying to cope with everyday concerns, and they would have a particular kind of sense of humor about it usually, and but it wasn't as though their lives and the things they thought about seemed that strange to me or different. And the more I worked alongside people who were healthy, the more I began to fit in with them, I think, and feel a lot as they did about life. Um, the pill I was taking for a while was called Risperdal. It's still commonly used, and it's a serotonin inhibitor. So one of the functions, one of the things it'll do is it'll take away a lot of the pain and pleasure, or at least the perception of it. Like I couldn't feel maybe 70% of my pain or pleasure that would go through my body. So I realized that one of the very basic and baseline things that people are going through is pain and pleasure, and that in their lives a lot of energy is actually spent trying to alleviate that or to find ways of coping with it. So when the pill helped take away my pain and pleasure, that left this huge field of openness and space in my mind. But the problem was it would sound kind of odd because it wouldn't be about intimacy or sexuality, and it wouldn't be about pain and coping. It would just be about abstract and odd thoughts instead of the things most people would focus on. And so the kind of thinking when I take the Risperdal was it would lead me into this area where I could abstract very easily, this area of thought where I could abstract easily, But it would go further and further from the kinds of things that the mainstream is usually preoccupied with, which is themselves and how they feel, their lives and what's going on in them. I'm not saying people are wrong to think those things. I'm just saying somehow the pill wasn't particularly helping me to improve. Over a number of decades, I felt, after treatment, I felt, well, they've kept me healthy. One of my doctors helped me stop smoking cigarettes, which was very helpful, I do say. And they've done a lot for me, but there's one thing they can't do, which is to cure the schizophrenia. So I kept thinking about why that was. And one of the realizations I had was that when I kept telling the doctors I could hear voices, so in the I guess it's the DSM is the book that lists symptoms. If a person hears voices, they're liable to have a diagnosis of some kind. If they hear a lot of them, it may be a psychosis, may receive a psychosis diagnosis. So one of my mistakes was to perceive my inner life as a series of voices that I heard, and then to tell the doctor that, because I can't explain entirely why, but it's a bit of a violation of what people will tolerate. If I tell the doctor that I have this thing going on in my head that trips off a wire in their head as a symptom, as something that people wouldn't want to see or think was going on, then the doctor will probably give me a diagnosis and treat me. Because I handed it right to the doctor, I said, I hear voices sometimes, and our culture doesn't want us to hear voices. We might see that in sort of a mythic view as some kind of weird experience, an epiphany of sorts that happens now and then. But we wouldn't want people to go around with voices in their head. From what I've observed, there are many people who talk to themselves, and it's quite possible that a lot of people hear voices or fragments of speech or something in their heads all the time. But when I told the doctor that, they had that information, they had to take it seriously because I was in for help. And so they said, okay, here's Thomas Park, he needs help. Now he tells me he hears voices, he agrees with that. Well, that would appear to be a symptom, and it is one in the DSM, or whatever that book is, or something such like that. So from the doctor's perspective, once I give them that symptom, it's a gimme. They're going to give me a diagnosis. And so to get beyond the schizophrenia notion, I reconceived of things, and I said, I think the way my brain works is not that wrong. It doesn't so much indicate a disability. It just is that I emphasized a certain aspect of my mental life that happens sometimes, and is also seen as something that people wouldn't want to happen. But to be honest with you, I'm not entirely convinced that although people wouldn't want voices to happen, that it means they don't. I think people do have various thoughts that disturb them. I think people who do not have diagnoses have patterns of thought and speech in their heads sometimes, and the mistake throughout seems to say that in that I'm different from other people, and I don't think I am. Significantly different. If they don't hear voices, then it's probably some other form of distraction, or hyperattention, or obsession, or something going on. Because I think most people have their own topography for their minds. Most people have some things that help them and some that don't, that they think and experience. So oddly enough, to perceive myself as apart from others, to become depressed, to not fight that depression in front of a hard-working doctor who watched me just sit there like a lump, to not stand up when they said I thought I was Jesus and just flatly deny it, which I should have, because I don't. And then to make this mistake of handing them something that happens in my head, which is a symptom and can be listed as one. It's a bit like handing them the whole thing in a folder and signed about what I have. And, when people are in a position of authority and have to treat, they're going to react to things like that, and they're not going to play a game and say, well, we're going to ignore that symptom. This is their job to do. If they have any questions asked, they can say, he told me himself he hears voices. So as the years would go by, it almost seemed like a little bit of a game. I'd go into the doctor's office, and we were on very polite terms. And she'd ask some questions about, am I on my medication? How's my weight? And then finally she'd come to the important one, are you hearing voices? And I would sit across from her, and in that position, in a public place with the doctor, I couldn't hear them. Because it would just be me and the doctor, and I'd look into her eyes and I'd say, well, yeah, sometimes I hear them. And she'd say, well, I wish there was something we could do about that. And then she'd say, I'll see you next month. I'd leave the room. I began thinking about how I present my mind and how it works, what it means to be accurate and honest, and when a person goes too far in providing details about what they think about, how it would feel to have someone tell you that they were hearing voices instead of paying attention to you. For example, maybe the doctor wanted me to pay attention to them and allow that connection to happen, instead of pursuing this kind of personal truth and saying, well, actually, there's a deeper view and I hear voices. Maybe it's a bit more subjective and a bit more choice oriented. This decision whether to report hearing voices and to whom and how. I know that seems odd and perhaps dark, but doctors are people too, and they have to work with what they're given, and they have a lot of demands placed on them. So I think that the main thing throughout was to realize, if I can acknowledge that what goes on in my mind does have a more normative experience than I thought, if I can perceive myself as amongst other people and very much the same as them, and not presume that what I experience is different. And it's a lot easier now that I'm older and I'm not doing acid all the time like I did in college. That's true. But, now that my mind is stilled and I'm older, it doesn't help me to speculate that the way I think is different from others, because I could never know. I could never know that. I remember I was reading Plato, and in Plato, the experience of the mind is said to be you're in a cave, and you can't see anything much, except that there's this play of light on the wall. It's the shadows of the fire. It sounds like the life of the mind isn't that clear. The life of the mind is about trying to make sense out of this moving flicker. It really isn't well-defined the way a schizophrenic might be. They might assume a person's mind is clear and perfect in a way it isn't anyway. They might assume that their confusion is unusual. It may not be. And in terms of the things schizophrenics tend to talk about, I started looking into how I would want people to see the way I think. I also watched some schizophrenics speaking to doctors on film, and almost all of them seem to be trying to portray themselves in a specific way and putting a lot of energy into it. What I noticed about a lot of people at work was there was partly that, but a lot of it was just very guttural, baseline, pain management, commiserating, and just very gut-level daily life stuff. Anyone who put too much into presenting themselves a certain way might be seen as a little bit hyper-focused on that. So, but the schizophrenic people would really have thought that they would say, this is who I am. And they'd have like a single idea. And they would just stick to that, but the world is not like that, and people don't think of it that way. So the more they try to present this image through their own objective, or rather through their own subjective efforts, the less healthy and the stranger things would seem. And so all of those basically point to this idea of accepting oneself for who one is, accepting that one's inner life and subjective life of the mind is not that odd, and just acting from the point that there's nothing wrong, particularly with one's unique experience. And also adding to the fact that with confidence and over the years, I was able to perform well at jobs, I was able to be married, write and play music, improvise and do a lot of things that I thought suggested that my mind was able enough to not be seen as a disabled person. Right now, I do not see myself as a disabled person. I do see myself as someone who has some characteristics that have been highlighted and analyzed. And I see myself as a person whose life has been scrutinized. But I can really thank myself, mostly, for having a breakdown and going to the doctor and basically handing my own case to the doctor by admitting that I heard voices and found those to be distracting. The doctor was left with very little choice than to give me a diagnosis. It's a bit like if you go to your manager at work and you say, I didn't want to mention this, but, I did dent a customer's car. Well, if the manager doesn't do anything about that, then they're not a manager. Once you give people that information, they're going to act upon it. If you don't give it to them, they may not know about it or think about it. I'm not promoting lying, but that's part of human nature. So it's interesting to think about more of a broad sociological reality, what expectations are, how people present themselves. And in my opinion, I haven't so much defeated disability through great effort and heroism, but come to accept myself as more alike others than not, and to assume that my mind is operating in a way that others could relate to, and not assume that I'm that different, whether that was an act of vanity or something darker from the beginning, I don't know. But it doesn't help to see myself as single, unique, and monadic, because I'm not. I'm a lot like other people. And that's the path that seems to lead back towards acceptance and normalcy, and what would be viewed as a quotidian thinker and a more normative mental life is simply to see things that way. So that's the great act of conquering schizophrenia, is to allow yourself to sort of melt back into the big bowl of reality and other people, and not try to fight that or point out again and again why it's not like that, but just to accept that it is and hopefully be pleased with that and find one's contentment and ability there. So, Thomas Park, over and out.